Hello and welcome to all the men and women of the West. I'm Joe, here from my co-host Dan.
Hello and greetings.
And today we have another Silmarillion podcast for you all. I know people have been waiting impatiently for this. It's just, we've been busy for quite a while. We're finally at Of the Sun and Moon and the Hiding of Valinor. Right here, we've got to reference the fact that there's a reference to how Telperion bore at last upon a leafless bough one great flower of silver, and Laurelin a single fruit of gold. Silver and gold are both symbols of wealth. Silver has a certain symbolism of immortality or eternity. Gold of royalty. What is more is that Yavanna and Nienna are called to try to heal the trees, but they're not able to do this. Instead, the two trees bear respectively a single flower and a single fruit, which Yavanna takes, with the two trees later standing as lifeless stems, a memorial of vanished joy, as Tolkien puts it. There's something haunting about that. That said, the flower and the fruit are given to Aule and Manwë, with Manwë hallowing them and Aule making vessels for them to preserve their radiance, as is said in the Narsillion, the Song of the Sun and Moon. I can't remember if Tolkien actually wrote the Narsillion. I imagine he probably did. And if it's not been published yet, it'll soon be published at some point, thanks to the Tolkien estate. These vessels are given to Varda, that they might become lamps in the heavens. These she would have traverse the lower regions of Ilmen. And Isilda-Sheen, the Vanyar, named the moon. The flower of Telperion was dubbed Isilda-Sheen, while Anar the Fire Golden, the fruit of Laurelin, was named the sun. So we essentially have a myth for the moon and sun. But the Noldor named them also Rana, the wayward, and Vasa, the heart of fire that awakens and consumes. Now that they've got their beacons, so to speak, of lunar moonlight and sunlight, the Valar now had to choose riders. They chose from amongst the Maiar. For the sun, they chose Aryan, and for the moon, it was Tilion. There's an early draft where Melkor tried to violate Aryan in a certain way because he came to desire her when he saw her, but he was burnt in the attempt, which is fitting. Aryan is one of the most feisty and fearsome of the Valar and Maiar. Now, this story about Aryan, now canon is a loose idea with Tolkien, because there's so many different drafts, but it's not really canon, given that Silmarillion, the various smaller books, Lord of the Rings and Hobbit are supreme in the canon. We have to go with that. And so Aryan was not violated. But this does give us insight into the characters and how Tolkien imagined their personalities to work like. Because Melkor, in this rough draft, wanted to wed Aryan so that he could have her light and her fire for himself, harkening back to the theme of him wanting the Silmarils. Aryan did not wish for him because she knew he was evil. And here again we have the notion that it's not about simple muscle power that makes a Valar. Aryan and Melian, for example, are far more powerful than most of the Valar. In turn, the Valar have their positions due to other traits. Tilion was apparently a hunter from the company of Orome. He had a silver bow, and he loved silver. Isil was first wrought and made ready. The first of the two vessels, or chariots, that were prepped was that of Isil, so that the moon was older than the sun. Thus, Tilion took off into the heavens. And he had traversed the heavens apparently 7 times before he arrives in the furthest east, and that's when Arian's chariot is made ready. Anar rises in glory, of course, and there's a great image in the Silmarillion copy that I have, the hardcover edition, of the first sunrise, which it actually looks beautiful.
I can't help but be enthralled by it.
I know. I think it's Alan Howe who drew this. The idea that Varda has is that each of the two vessels have to constantly be moving in a cycle. That said, we then get an explanation of some of the details of their journeys. Mostly that Tilion rarely ever tarried in Valinor because he liked to just brace saw, and he'd go on a lot of journeys. Rarely ever returns. Who could blame him? Said Tilion is always trying to chase after Aryan because he desires her. But Aryan is always off like an arrow and never stopping for him. It is said that Morgoth greatly hated these new lights. He's not happy about this because it ruined his work. He worked hard to ruin the world, and these two upstarts go and give people light 24 hours. As punishment, he decided to invent the most dreaded thing imaginable: daylight savings, just to screw these two over. Yes, I have a beef with daylight savings times. Sue me. Only Morgoth could have thought of it, or his ilk.
I can agree with you there.
That said, apparently Arian is someone that Morgoth feared. There was an attack launched on Tilion. The Valar began to fear for him and Arian, but the ship was soon righted, so to speak. Tilion was soon back off like a shot, journeying through the heavens. That's all that happens in this chapter. It's basically an explanation of the sun and the moon.
We have a lot of references to other mythologies, like Helios' chariot.
And Selene. Sol and Magni in the Norse myths, though with those two, they're perpetually hunted by the shadows, and eventually they're going to be devoured by wolves just before Ragnarok, which is the great battle, the twilight of the gods, when Othin and all his hosts will be destroyed, and in turn destroy all that the giants have, so that Balder could claim the kingship, because Othin is just there to prepare the way for Balder, essentially. You have, for solar and lunar myths, the Japanese, of course. We have to make reference to them. They're some of the most popular or renowned, with Amaterasu and Tsukuyomi, with Tsukuyomi sometimes being portrayed as male, sometimes female, but either way, Tsukuyomi is typically a villain. The Aryan thing being so beautiful that everybody is drawn to her. Clear nod to Amaterasu Omikami Dono. Although, I believe Sol, whom is a goddess in Norse mythology, the personification of the sun, is, I imagine one could probably see a bit of influence from there as well. With Tilion getting lost and whatnot, I think that's pure Tolkien.
It's hard to find a moon god that's
a bit of a inspiration. I'd almost argue you could see a bit of a reference to Apollo with the bow. Some minor influence of Tsukuyomi. The character who's given more attention is Arian, I find. Now, she's chosen to lead the chariot because she was from the very beginning a spirit of fire, kind of like Fëanor, and she never feared Morgoth's hosts, and apparently is stronger than Morgoth in raw power, at least as a warrior, and she was never deceived into his service. The fact that there's so much emphasis put on her warrior nature, I would argue this smacks of Amaterasu, whom was the samurai goddess. Yeah, like I said, there's clear Aryan Amaterasu parallels. I don't know how much Tolkien might have known about Shintoism, but we have to bear in mind that I'd be very curious to see if he had read up a little about Japanese Shintoism after World War II, because we have to bear in mind there was a huge outpouring of knowledge and translations that were made from around the time of the 1920s, yes, before World War II, about Asia and their myths and their histories, all the way through to the 60s, as we learned more and more here in the West about the East, and found out that, contrary to propaganda from some places, they were not in any way backwards. Actually, let's be honest, the Chinese, Koreans, and Japanese, for example, along with the rest of Asia, had civilizations every bit as advanced as Rome, at the height of Rome, and every bit as advanced as the Carolingian Empire, in the case of the Tang, and you have novels, which the novel format of storytelling was invented in Japan, and you had the most sophisticated warriors on the planet being the Japanese samurai, who were scientists of gunpowder. After guns were brought to Japan, they were fierce warriors. They were philosophers of an unparalleled sort when philosophy had almost come to a standstill at one point in the West. The Koreans emancipated their slaves long before the West did under the Korean Joseon Emperor Sukjong. Not enough can be said about the cultural sophistication of the Bushi or samurai of Japan. And I only make reference to the East because we do need to pay homage to the wisdoms they have and had, and the knowledge and the cultural accomplishments they've made over the course of several thousand years. In a lot of ways, the East and the West are very, very much each other's equal, and they do need each other. As for Arian, she's a fascinating character with shades of Amaterasu thrown in, whether consciously or unconsciously on Tolkien's part. Although I lean towards the suspicion that there might have been some consciousness there. As for Tilion, I would say there's a strong inspiration from Magni of Norse myths. I believe it's Magni, who's the lunar god, and Apollo, a Helios-type character pulling the moon, and you have a female pulling the sun chariot, when in Greek mythology you have Selene who's pulling the lunar chariot. So right there, yeah, you've got these two chariots being pulled across the heavens. Interesting that at the sight of the sun, the Noldor are inspired and push on even harder for Middle-earth, those with Fingolfin. So clearly it was an inspiring sight in the history of Middle-earth. This is probably one of the greatest and most symbolic moments when the sun first rises on the horizon, because it's the first hint that Morgoth's not going to have his way every time, and that there is hope for the Noldor. Anything else you want to add?
I was just going to mention the aspect of hope. I mean, no matter how dark the night may be,
the sun is always just around the corner.
Exactly.
Yeah, and the night is darkest just before the dawn, as it's said in Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight. Anyways, tell us what you think. Smash that like and that subscribe button as though you were Luthien singing with all her might to them.